Who's that with Dad?
I overheard a few bits and pieces of their conversation. I think he's that old high school friend Dad sometimes mentions.
A guitar player?
Yeah, the one that went away and never returned. Dad was saying, I guess you didn't want to settle down. Marriage, mortgage, all of the baggage. Anyway, he hasn't seen or heard from him for about 30 years now. He just happened to meet him today. I guess it's just one of those coincidences.
How do they recognize each other? Dad doesn't look anything like he did in the high school yearbooks.
Yeah, but I guess there are some things about people that never change. Dad's voice was probably as annoying then as it is now. Anyway, it seems that he moved up north after leaving school. He lived in the bush. He was like, I liked living on next to nothing. I guess he didn't want any responsibilities, obligations.
So he's been living in the bush for the past 30 years?
No. He left for Europe after that.
How long has he been back in Canada?
I think he just returned a few months ago. Dad was trying to convince him to talk about all the years he was away. But he seemed reluctant for some reason. Maybe he didn't really do much.
I've never talked to anyone about my life on the road. Never really wanted to. Outside of job talk, most people are interested in friends, family, celebrities. When the talk turns to strangers in strange places, they don't want to know. They soon lose interest. And why not? But you and I go back a ways, and you say you want to know. So for you, I'm ready to take a stab at it. Just sights and sounds, as best I can remember them. Whatever comes to mind. Will that do?
Sounds good, Rob. And I'll make sure you don't go dry.
If you tire, we can take a break or stop altogether if it's not for you. Once in Europe, I hooked up with some gypsies. I learned that their people came from the Asian subcontinent about 1,000 years ago and eventually made their way to Europe. They were tinkers, livestock handlers, musicians. The women danced, told fortunes. That started me thinking about India and Pakistan too. About whether there might still be places where people keep to the old ways. I headed east. There were times when one thing would set me in the direction of another. Maybe I wouldn't have spent time in Ladakh if I hadn't seen these dancers in Delhi. There were many dancers and musicians performing that day from all over India on the grounds of the Red Fort. There was no entrance charge, and the poor drifted in from the streets. Audiences were closely packed in tight circles, leaving just enough room for the performers. saw these dancers. Dancers with wonderful faces, gentle faces. Their clothing looked to be made of felt, velvet, brocade. And the women's headdresses seemed to be covered in beautiful turquoise stones, patterned stones. They were moving in a slow circle, holding their scarves high with the right hand. These people, unlike any I'd ever seen before, were Ladakis, from what they call the roof of the world, between the Zanskar and Karakoram mountain ranges, 12,000 feet above sea level. Not long afterward, I made my way to Leh, the capital of the region. Moving out from the capital, I spent time with some farmers. The landscape was starkly beautiful. It was sowing time. The animals pulling the wooden plows were crosses between yak and cow. While the men plowed and sowed, the women would be raking in unison and singing in sort of a chant, working and chanting in an atmosphere so thin that at first I could hardly breathe. It's heavy work. They did it all day long. They coaxed a living out of that thin, sandy soil. A few strains of fast-growing dryland wheat, barley, milk, butter, tea. That's their diet. Sometimes there'd be apricots, walnuts, seasonal garden vegetables, and chang, liquor distilled from wheat. On special occasions, there'd be a large get-together at somebody's house. And tent or canopy would be raised. There'd be archery contests, food, drink, live music. At the end of the day, dancing. The children had tiny bows and arrows cut to size. They loved getting in the way of the big people. Well, I had the impression that the more they drank, the better they got. I think it was more likely that as the day wore on, the less skilled were simply eliminated from the competition. Habits, customs, they can be so different from ours. A woman would sometimes stick her tongue out at me, gesture of disdain, right? But the expression on the face didn't match. I found out later it was a sign of welcome, not rejection. And their religion, they live it. It's everywhere. Prayer flags on the rooftops, religious mounds symbolizing the Buddha's presence, monasteries housing one or more members of almost every family, rooms set aside in people's houses, very private places, places dedicated to worship. Monasteries cling to the sides of cliffs. Looked at from a side view, they appear insubstantial. They blend with the cliff, are hard to make out. But when you move to the front, you see their substance. They cover the cliff. Once inside, you expect peace, quiet. But what you find instead is a kind of barely managed bedlam. Children loudly instructing other children in Scripture. Children boisterously attacking Scripture. One with a pointer standing at the blackboard. The others responding to the instruction in a kind of exuberant, counterpoint. And the master looks on, sometimes speaking quietly to one or more of the children. And you see children studying alone, reading out loud from the scriptures, sometimes swaying from side to side. All under the watchful eye of the master. Mandalas, tankas, murals give pictorial representation to the scriptures. And in one monastery, a huge Buddha seated in the lotus position with vivid coloring, in marked contrast to the grays and the browns of the terrain. A world apart. Maybe it was the religion, maybe the simple, isolated life. I don't know. But these people, they were as kind, as gentle as any people I've ever met. Anywhere. And another time, it was dancers again that set me to wondering. They were singing, beating on drums, jumping about, and they were black. Not Dravidians from the south. Dravidians can be as black as any African, but black people with African features. I found out that they were from Bhuj and Kutch, that they were the descendants of the slaves of prosperous Gujarati merchants, descendants of the ones who stayed behind when the British abolished slavery. To Bhuj. Once there, I asked around about these people, but nobody seemed to know what I was talking about. Eventually, I came across this fellow, a museum worker, who told me that they lived a short distance from where we stood. He pointed me in the right direction. After a short walk, I was there. Many of them looked to be the product of a string of interracial marriages. Others showed no sign of it. But whatever their appearance, they got along well together. If there was segregation, I didn't see it. And if there are similar communities in other parts of India, I'm not aware of them. Up to that point, what I'd seen of Kutch fascinated me. I decided to head up north to the Ran, separating Kutch from Pakistan. Up there are villages close to one another, but very different from each other. In some, there were conical, whitewashed clay huts with thatched roofs, attractive enough from the outside. But once inside, it was magical, overwhelming. Sometimes every square inch of the walls would be covered with intricate patterns, molded, painted patterns. Section would be set aside for the family's brass, copperware. There'd be carpets on the walls, beds, cradles if there were babies. Others had unremarkable architecture, but the people, it seemed that no matter how long you looked at them, there was always more to see. The children, shy at first, soon accepted me. Their arm bracelets and head ornaments, they were part of their lives, had been part of their lives for centuries. They couldn't understand my fascination, but again, they got used to it. And many looked at me in much the same way I looked at them. To them, I suppose I was the exotic. When I first happened upon a place, it'd be the children I'd see. It's the same everywhere. Adults hesitate. Children are curious. They're open, trusting. First one, usually the bravest, would come close for a look-see. Others would follow, each vying for my attention. And strange as it may sound, coming from someone like me, it felt good. Kids, bouncing other kids on their hips. Bouncing kids not much smaller than them. Kids, smiling for all they were worth, breaking into unrestraining laughter. And the shyer ones, with a trace of a smile, maybe holding back just a little bit. If there was a pool of water around, they'd make their own fun. Maybe showing off some if they saw that I was watching. I remember one child who looked very familiar, like a character from an animated feature film that I saw when I myself was a small child. To me, he looked like Dopey, one of the 7 dwarfs. And in the Orison fishing village, kids pulling at a fish's skin, trying to tear it off the body. Falling over with the effort, laughing. Anyway, the children are memorable. I call up their faces without effort. And they led me to the parents. Without them, I'm not sure I could have done what I did. There were times when I literally owed my bread and my lentils to them. happened on a place that appealed, I'd stay a while. Old towns, mostly. In Rajasthan, Gujarat, up north. The people in those places lived their lives on the streets. The shops and cafes were mostly open. Ceaseless activity, movement. You remember the Ladakhi greeting? The coastal Orissans also had a distinctive practice. They smoked cigars, the ladies too. Unremarkable enough in itself until I realized that, at least part of the time, they held the lit end in their mouths. A tricky business, it seemed to me. Why would they do this? To increase the life of the cigar and to heighten its potency. Good reasons both in a place where you see little going to waste. Shanty towns, for example. You must have seen pictures. When you got up close, you realized they were built out of every conceivable material. Plastic bags, cardboard, tin, anything that could be used for shelter. And these places would often be located next to large construction projects. Office buildings, hotels, even embassies. The workers had to be handy to the construction site because hours are long and commuting's slow and expensive. They'd come with their families and squat, and people providing basic services would follow. The larger the site, the larger the community that would grow up around it, and the more settled these people would become during its long life. A parallel community, in a way, to the one which paid their wages. Whenever I saw one of these older urban shanty towns, I knew that the work that had brought them there was long done. And dung cakes, cow patties, fundamental fuel. You'd see them plastered on walls to dry, women bent to the task of fashioning them. And the vultures, nature's indefatigable cleaning machines. Whenever you saw them perched in their long lines, you knew there was something close that was set to call it a day. That they would soon be starting their work. In the markets, sheer desperation drove much of it. You'd see people sifting through the vendors' throwaways, keeping anything that looked edible, or that might be used in some other way. If I happened to be in a Muslim community during the days of what they call the Great Feast, I'd always wander about, occasionally riding in a horse-drawn carriage, what they call a tonga. Animals would be slaughtered. The streets would run with blood. And the poor would be given meat. As I said, life in the old quarters was lived in the street. Everything would be laid out in front of me, in front of everyone. Many of the houses had courtyards. Space would be set aside for the bleeding. Sometimes you'd see it in a public place, where people would gather to watch, wait. It's unsettling, particularly to the uninitiated. But the charitable side of it, you can't argue with that. This talk of butchering reminds me of the way butchers would sometimes hold the handle of a cutting knife between their toes leaving both hands free for holding, cutting. Sometimes a sock would be worn if it was colder. They'd go barefoot if it was hot. Not that you'd never see fixed knives attached to counters or straight counter cutting. Mostly though, they just curl up into a squat and use the toes. Most markets, you know, are open air, sometimes lighted so the vendors could work into the night. More fresh stuff would be available in the summer. Seasonal vegetables, fruit, that sort of thing. More flies too. Sometimes you'd have to breathe through your nose if you didn't want a mouthful. There'd be times when they'd have to be brushed aside to get a look at what was on offer. Or the vendor would work a whisk to save you the trouble. And the smells. I'd spend time in the spice section for relief. There'd be large mounds of colorful, pungent spices, crowding out the less salubrious smells of the place. Like the meat in the fish sections. Your nose would tell you where they were. And the fowl was fresh. Live chickens would be kept in pens until sold. Customer would have to wait while the chicken was dispatched. Scalded, plucked, and gutted. But you knew the carcass hadn't been sitting around. All there for the seeing. Craftspeople will often practice their particular art street side. Spinners driving a single spindle with a large hand-rotated wheel. interlacing complex patterns into the cloth, making this intricate work look effortless. Potters turning their wheels with a deftly handled stick, building up speed, enough speed to see them through the making earthenware vessel. Jewelers manipulating tweezers, carefully moving the makings about, using small burners as heat sources, lighting them from a small flame when they were needed for specific jobs. Blowing through narrow cylinders, generating a torch to meld the various components. But the particular craft that I found most startling, one that I thought would have long since disappeared, was the handcrafting of large dowels. I saw this in the Gulf of Kutch, off the Arabian Sea. Boys would be shepherding donkeys, oxen hauling logs, camels, munching on fodder, taking it easy between jobs. I went inside one of these boats as it was being built. Men would be using hand tools to fashion beams. They'd be moving these beams about with the help of fulcrums, pulleys. But the only source of power was human muscle. Inside that boat, there were moments when I lost all sense of time and place. You know, when you think of India's religions, you think of Hindus, Muslims, Buddhists. Christian missionaries always followed in the wake of the European explorers, so you'd expect some Christianity from that source. Although the Jews did get around, Judaism is not a religion that most people associate with India. But I found the Jews are said to have lived in South India, just inland from the Malabar coast, since the 6th century BC. And Christians, Syrian Christians, since the 2nd century AD. It's believed that the Jews first came when Nebuchadnezzar occupied Jerusalem. And then again later, in the 1st century, to get away from the Romans. The last 200 years or so, most of them have left Cochin, immigrating to Europe, and more recently to Israel. Signs saying Jewtown still pinpoint the location of the few that remain. Christians presumably came for similar reasons. Their existence was first documented by a 2nd century visitor from Alexandria who found a Hebrew copy of Matthew's Gospel. If we're talking antiquity, it wasn't just people from the Middle East who made their way to the Malabar coast. Centuries back, Chinese traders left a very picturesque fishing machine behind still in use today. You'd see them lined up just offshore. Arched poles, operated by pulleys, levers. I remember one day when the regulation crew was having trouble raising one of the nets. And one by one, other fishermen made their way onto the thing to lend a hand. Finally, the net broke loose from whatever was holding it. And they hauled her in. It looked to be breakage, but probably nothing that couldn't be repaired. And the guild would be there to help if it came to that.
How did you learn all this, the history?
Great place for books, India. Huge variety in the shops. And inexpensive, too. I'm not really sure why. Anyway, there was no shortage of interesting literature. And I had the time to indulge. A word of caution, though. Although it sounds like I'm spouting gospel, I'm very much a layman. So all of my history chatter should be taken with a very large grain of salt. But right or wrong, I'm not about to pass up an opportunity to mouth a name like Nebuchadnezzar. Anyway, I made my way through the backwaters, up into the hills. Life in the backwaters is left right at the waterline. I wasn't there during the heavy rains, but it sure looked like it wouldn't take much to cause an overflow. You never really knew what might turn up around the next bend. Coconut husks would be piled high in the backwaters. After the husks had softened underwater, people would take and beat the fiber out of them and use the fiber to make rope. Everybody worked, including the small children. In the hills, you find tea plantations. Ladies would be bagging, carrying fertilizer to spread among the plants. There'd be waterfall-fed streams that could be tapped for irrigation. And spices, pepper, ginger, turmeric, cardamom. I remember one tribal village where there were lots of spices and fruits, coffee and cocoa too, growing in a nearby forest. And there was this large tree with a hole cut in it, and a cobra statue and a flower inside. Every Friday they would put a tray of milk and incense beside the statue. They claimed that a cobra, a goddess to them, lived inside the tree, that she would come down and feed off the milk. It was set up like a shrine, treated as a temple. I never saw the snake, but I doubt that they would have gone to all that trouble for nothing. Friendly, generous people. They enjoyed the guitar.
There must have been times when you needed money. Where did it come from?
I'd stay in towns. Word would get around that I played guitar. People that I met would pass the word. Servants, usually. They had the ear of their employers. Their employers depended on them, particularly when a get-together was in the works. My name would come up. As I became better known, the work became more frequent. My origins played to my advantage. Within certain circles, I became known as a must. That's how they'd put it, a must. At children's parties, I'd always share the stage. There'd sometimes be elephant rides, camel rides, performing monkeys. The monkeys would ape human behavior. An old man walking, dancing lady, marriage negotiations, domestic squabbling. Sometimes there'd be a dancing bear. Puppet show. Maybe a cobra and mongoose duo, both usually pretty sluggish, both performing their roles with no chance whatever of serious injury. And man-powered Ferris wheels at the larger gatherings, with a hot dog and thrown in, no extra charge. To kill the boredom, I guess.
What sort of music did you play?
There'd be no expectations. When I was in the countryside, playing for hospitality, I'd play my own stuff. The recognition factor wasn't there, so it was up to me. When I played for cash, I'd assess the mood. Sometimes there'd be a local group playing traditional music. They loved to jam. I'd be invited to join in. I'd alter my style to give it a local sound. It was an easy fit.
You moved among lots of different people, making yourself understood, understanding others. How did you manage that?
The place is huge, and there are lots of major languages, each spoken by millions. Telugu, Malayalam, Kannada, Punjabi, Gujarati, Urdu, just to mention some of them. And Hindi, the official one. So picture yourself in an Indian railway carriage. A carriage shared by people from different parts of the country. Cosmopolitans all. And once settled in for the journey, they want to talk. They quickly find that their native languages aren't shared, or at least don't appear to be shared. So one of them begins to speak English. After a moment's hesitation, the rest begin to respond in sing-song versions of the same language. Then there's no stopping them. Even in remoter parts, among isolated people, I soon stopped being surprised when I found someone with at least a smattering of English. Oh, I tried with marginal success to learn bits and pieces of the local languages. You know, the essential phrases for food and drink, greetings, farewell. As tools of last resort, I turned to the index finger for pointing and gestures, kind of charades, picture language. I always got along.
You took trains?
Sometimes. Buses too. People catch them on the run, hanging precariously from wherever they can get a handhold or a foothold. Even the roofs would be chock-a-block. People would perch up there, totally exposed. Whenever you heard of a serious accident, a ravine fall, let's say, that's how you'd account for the high fatality figures. They'd usually be far higher than the bus was built to seat. The road wrecks, carnage, mostly buses and trucks, especially when you got outside the urban areas. Sometimes you'd see these signs, accident zone. Once I saw one of them, turned a corner, and there it was, the promised wreck. You'd see trucks with broken axles. They'd break under the weight of the load. Unbalanced trucks would sometimes flip over, sometimes just collapse, leaning to one side. Reckless driving was common enough. Commercial drivers would have religious charms dangling from the rear view, charms to protect them from harm. Some of these drivers were completely detached, as if the deity were at the wheel, and no further involvement on their part was in any way necessary.
A while back, I saw something on TV that mentioned India's holy men. Sadhus, I think they were called. Did you ever see any of them?
Hindus love festivals, celebrations. So much so that they seem to be quite eclectic about it, easily blending the festivities of other religions with their own. And these festivals, they're celebrated everywhere in some way. They penetrate every nook and cranny of the country. But there are places, holy places, fested with special religious significance. And the celebrations in these places are huge, organized events. They have to be. The pilgrims, sometimes numbering in the millions, come from all over India, and they have to be housed and fed. Almost all these pilgrims, the poorer ones for sure, they've never traveled much beyond the borders of their villages. And to do the pilgrimage, likely the only real journey they'll ever take, it takes sacrifice, consumes all their resolve, their savings. They're traveling to an unfamiliar place, suffer considerable hardship to get there, and they often seem disoriented, uncomfortable. And then there are the others, the holy men, the sadhus. They're said to make the journey from remote hideaways, caves, forests, mountaintops. I never came across these hideaways, and I never saw the sadhus in transit on the roads. I only saw them in cities, towns, usually in the railway stations, the temples, begging bowl at hand. I never went out of my way to visit the holy cities. I don't know why. I never went out of my way to avoid them either. That's not to say that I never spent any time in the temples. Every town would have a few. They'd be social centers, sometimes places of great beauty, cool, sedate places, tiled and marbled, offering respite. I guess it's the Jain temples I'm thinking of. The Jains, a gentle sect dating back to the 6th century BC. A people who show concern for all living things. They had a special skill with marble and tile. The temples that I saw were built long ago, but the craftsmen are probably still handy, tools at the ready, waiting for someone to give them the go-ahead to do it again. On a good day, I'd be in a temple when the ladies would take up a kind of chant, even though I would have no idea what it was about. It'd somehow be comforting to sit back, watch, listen. If it was a mosque, the music makers would be men. Your mention of the sadhus, I'm not sure why, but it brought to mind street entertainers. An interesting thing about these entertainers, almost without fail, as a surefire crowd pleaser, they'd include a stunt that would look to be terribly painful, lifting sizable objects with nothing more than the underside of the eyelid, let's say. And this type of thing would be blended with items that you'd maybe see in street theater here. Stuff suggesting danger, knife juggling, sword swallowing. Or stuff simply requiring special skills. Axe with spinning tops, sticks and body parts, all manipulated in various ways. Usually the whole family would be involved. The younger ones working the crowd. The very young, the infants, would sometimes be sitting nearby, looking cute, paying the elders no attention whatsoever. They're enthusiastic, crowd-pumping elders. I had no real way of knowing, of course, but the whole spectacle, it seemed the sort of thing that wouldn't have been out of place in medieval Europe. Ghost towns. Fatapir Sikri, the sandstone capital built by the Mughal Emperor Akbar. That's the famous one, the one that's on the tourist map. But there are others, a whole group of them, in the desert, close to each other. And they don't seem to be on anybody's map. The towns are tiny, but they have forts, and they contain many large mansions, palaces, most of them deserted. Some have caretakers. Some have squatters in the courtyards. The rest are abandoned, or at least they were when I bedded there. I was told that up to the last century, wealthy merchants lived in these towns, working the spice road between China and the Gujarati coast. When the trade moved to port cities, the merchants moved with it. To Bombay, Madras, Calcutta. Other than trade, these small towns have nothing to sustain them. You'd see the odd herdsman, but much of the desert country won't support crops. Streets are virtually deserted. But the mansions themselves, row on row, huge, handcrafted wooden brass doors, balconies overlooking large courtyards, intricate, brightly colored frescoes telling stories, showing daily life, history in a way. People would be in the courtyards cooking. I even came across a small candle factory that had been set up in one of them. Even though all these mansions and palaces were in some sort of disrepair, the level of decay was not all of a kind. I was told that some of the merchant families, successful still, occasionally send money for maintenance. One thing sure, there was once tremendous wealth there. Tremendous wealth, cheek to jowl. All gone now. But it takes little imagination to visualize what it must have been like in its prime. You know, the further south you go in India, the more liquid the food becomes. The bits and pieces of vegetables and sauces are served in small metal dishes. The rice, the mainstay of the meal, is served on a large metal platter. The diner soaks the rice in the sauce, rolls the highly spiced food into a little ball, pops the ball into his mouth in one neat, fluid movement. The further north you go, cooking introduced by the Mughals becomes more common. The tourism industry promotes the Mughal legacy of the 16th to the 18th centuries. They built many of the forts, the tombs. Everyone's heard of the Taj Mahal, a monument to romantic love. Shah Jahan's love for his Mumtaz. Most tours include the Delhi, Agra, Jaipur triangle. A nice, tight little journey through the architectural legacy of the Mughals and the Rajputs. I saw these places myself. Meat dishes predominate in northern cooking. The food's less spicy than in the south. Maybe temperament is partly molded by diet. I guess you're on shaky ground if you generalize, though, so I won't. Speaking about the north reminds me of the frontier people, the Patan. A people as hard and craggy as their homeland. The conquerors came and went, from Alexander through to the British. And as far as I know, these people were never really subdued. Barely contained, at best. And then only when it suited them. Many carry locally manufactured arms, just in case. And there's the code. The hospitality side of it, I experienced in full measure. Hospitality would be extended to complete strangers. And if you were in their charge, they'd sooner die before they let you be harmed. I couldn't make a move without an armed escort. And I was grateful. I felt safe. The other side of the code I never saw, but there's no doubt that it's there. If a member of the tribe is troubled in any way, or is perceived to have been troubled, it must be avenged. And thus the cycle begins, running through the generations. Hatfield and McCoy, 1,000 times over. I never saw it, but I sure heard about it. The women go about their business in full burqa, everything covered, with a face mesh, so they can see you, but you can't see them. You see the little ones, and the man, always the man. Sometimes I'd see a very distinctive type of entertainment. Ostentatiously dressed, aggressively forward dancers, extroverts, each jockeying for a front-end position, each trying to be more provocative than the rest. They'd gather at festive occasions. Weddings. Usually leaving not long after they arrived.
What about the women?
Women.
What were they like?
Both the men and the women are very graceful. And this is reflected in their dance. fairly compelling dance the Rajasthani ladies do involves carrying an ever-increasing number of pots on the head, something most women in India have to do, carrying pots each and every day. There's also classical dance, the kind that requires schooling. It's great fun watching the youngsters show their stuff. Talk of the Rajasthani dancers puts me in mind of the desert people, nomads, a proud and independent people who travel with all they have: livestock, bedding, tents, cooking utensils. Babies would be perched up on the backs of camels. Kids and lambs riding side saddle on pack animals. Dogs would even hitch rides on donkeys. The music and the entertainment came at the day's end after the travel. I play guitar. Sometimes I'd sing. The women do much of the hard labor. You see them as hod carriers in construction projects. Salt flats. plus all the domestic stuff. You know, the cooking, cleaning, carrying water. Where it's arid, life revolves around the village well. At set times, the women fetch water. They gather together, socialize around the well. There are practical considerations too. Water is needed for cooking. The cooking. Unleavened bread. The ubiquitous chapati in its various sizes and shapes. Sometimes a small hut would be specially built for it. When someone was working the fire, you'd barely be able to see or breathe inside those huts. And the cleaning. Now for the laundry, space would be set aside on the street. Or near water. The clothes would be repeatedly banged against a rock or any flat surface, literally smashing the dirt out of them. The sweepers would take care of the rest after a fashion. They'd work bent over. Small brooms wouldn't permit them to stand upright. And the results were dubious. Seems to me that they were simply shifting the dust around. More a ritual than a practical task. At times I felt that women were the cement holding it all together.
You spoke earlier of the drylands. Where do they get the water to grow crops?
Wells to supplement the rainwater. The mechanics are simple. A type of pulley aqueduct system to raise and transport the water. And the bullocks to set it all in motion. Watching it, it was kind of hypnotic. Out on the fields, you'd see grain being threshed by camel hooves. Camels pulling a kind of wooden harrow with a man riding on it, guiding the camel with a lead. Groundwater levels are dropping though. Pressures are relentless. Too much out, too little in. Where there's vegetation, land that won't support crops will be grazed. In places, there's not much other than thorn bushes for feed. You'd think the animals would be discouraged by the thorns, but the goats manage to work their tongues around them to get at the good stuff growing close to the stem.
When you mentioned the children, you talked about the shyer ones holding back a little. I have the feeling that you're holding something in reserve, that you've been places that aren't for sharing. At least not yet. Get me right though. The whole day has been pure serendipity. But I'm not about to use you up tonight. I want to spread it around some. If you're game.
I guess I was a little hesitant at the start. But you know, running into you, this whole thing, it took me by surprise. Once I got into it, though, the recollections flowed. That wouldn't have happened if you weren't interested. We will do it again. Soon. There's always more to tell. Where else can I get a steady supply of high test for an evening's banter?